Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar on the latest intel on limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So there's been a little bit happening, obviously, with the benchmark interest rates going up. We've obviously seen, 10 or up until the last 2 months, I think it was like 10 interest rate rises in a row. So clearly that has had an impact on limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So hopefully through today's session, we can talk a little bit about what that actually means for clients that are in the LRBA space moving forward, because I certainly can't see the interest rates coming down in a hurry, and that would mean that for many, with the significant the significant increase that we saw, it does mean that we're going to have some potential issues with regards to what clients have to do moving forward. So, usual disclaimer, obviously, that everything is up to date based on my preparation of the presentation by the end of yesterday, and of course, there's a bit happening in the superannuation space this year, and I think limited recourse borrowing arrangements, as I'm going to allude to through the presentation, have maybe a bit of water to go under the bridge with regards to the objective of superannuation, but only time will tell. We're still waiting on that from a government point of view. We were told that we'd have something in the first part of the year. We haven't seen anything then or since then, we wait with anticipation to see whether or not there are going to be any changes within the legislation. Apologise for my throat, a bit croaky. This is hour 6 of presenting this week for myself, so certainly been testing the old vocal cords. So what are we going to talk about today? So the use of limited recourse borrowings and particularly the intermediary limited recourse borrowing arrangements. I did a webinar for SuperGuardian back in, I think it was April 2022, on limited recourse borrowing arrangements, and talked a little bit about these intermediary LRBAs. And since that time, there's been probably a bit more provided by groups like the SMSF Association and the Tax Office with regards to the interaction between intermediary LRBAs and things such as the total superannuation or total super balance. So hopefully I can give you a bit of an update on, or not hopefully, I can give you a bit of an update on that position today, but also the way that limited recourse borrowing arrangements interact with total superannuation balances as well. Clearly, the safe harbour rules are of significance for us all, particularly given that we do have the increase to the benchmark interest rates and what impact that actually has. And I also will, in that instance, speak about Div 7A loans as well. So, comparing a Div 7A loan with a related party loan from a PCG 2016/5. So we'll look at those sort of side by side to ensure that funds are complying with both in the set of circumstances where there are related entities that are doing the lending. Also want to look into some recent findings, and by recent I mean at the end of last year there were some findings around limited recourse borrowing arrangements, and that's what I suggest sort of pushes into the concept of where super sits with regards to the objective of superannuation, and certainly the findings were that largely SMSFs and limited recourse borrowing arrangements are being used for the right reasons and are not necessarily problematic. But of course we would all see issues associated with them, and again, without making it the entirety of today's presentation, I think the changes in interest rates for the benchmark PCG document for our safe harbour rules, I think that is going to have a fairly significant impact on limited recourse borrowing arrangements, particularly as we exit and have exited any COVID relief, but where we marry COVID relief with benchmark interest increases, then where do we sit in regards to the whole repayment requirement? So I think there's a fair bit to contemplate in that space, looking at things such as refinancing what happens when we've repaid limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So yeah, that's the broad nature of today's presentation, and what I'm going to go through over the next hour with you all. I've got a couple of examples in there. As always, if you've got any questions, please put them in the question and answer space on Zoom. Everybody will be provided with a copy of the presentation following today, so a copy of the notes will be provided, and also you'll have access to a link of the recording if you want to go back and watch it. So all of that will come post the event. So what we have to obviously look at, and this is, I guess, a bit of a summary, bit of a recap of the LRBA rules, but that super reform has had on those LRBA rules. We all know that we came from an existence of pre-2010, where we had our original instalment warrants under 67(4)(a). We then moved into the first sort of LRBA iteration under sort of some form of reform where it changed things such as the single acquirable asset, and we had our post-July 2010 with our 67A and 67B replacement assets. And then we had 2017 super reform, and the super reform certainly brought LRBAs into the attention of such matters as the transfer balance cap, and probably more importantly, or more specifically, the total superannuation balance. And festering away behind all of this is, of course, the non-arm's length income provisions. And whilst we saw the onset of PCG 2016-5, which was a direct result of tax determination 2016-16, which in itself was a flow-on from multiple ATO interpretive decisions around interest rates and the non-arm's length impact of that. What we obviously have seen since 2018 is the changes to the NALI provisions to incorporate fund expenses, and of course that was, to most people's position, exclusively directed at limited recourse borrowing arrangements and lower interest rates. But of course, it's taken on its whole life of its own in this NALI space. And not only are we focusing on it from an LRBA point of view, but we're now focusing on it from a general expense position as well. But those NALI changes are in effect since 1 July 2018. And so particularly as we review our PCG 2016-5 safe harbour rules, we want to make absolute certainty that any clients that are operating under that environment are doing the right thing with regards to their repayments and the various terms with regards to LRBAs, to ensure that they don't have any NALI provisions. Now, it's fair to say that when we look through some of the safe harbour requirements today, if we talk about things like fixed interest, then those that did jump on under the PCG to a fixed arrangement in the early periods, particularly when the interest rates were down, say, at 5.1%, then clearly we have to make sure that we're monitoring any requirements under the existing loan arrangement to make sure they understand what their obligations are when they come out of that fixed interest period, which is set at a maximum of 5 years. So a lot to take into consideration with regards to limited recourse borrowing arrangements and the moving beast that they are. And we want to make sure that people are on top of all of the key issues. As we know, those key requirements are that it must be applied to the acquisition of a single acquirable asset. And despite the ruling 2012-1 coming out basically 10, 11 years ago now, you still get asked a lot of questions. I know I do, with regards to whether or not a property will meet that condition of the single acquirable asset. I don't get a lot of questions in regards to non-property based investments, but certainly they still exist out there in the sort of the broader superannuation ether. But primarily the question as to whether or not a property would satisfy that single acquirable asset definition is still pretty key, and we need to be comfortable with that when talking to clients about the whole idea of the physical asset. So regardless of the number of titles as such, that the physical asset, if it sort of impedes the ability to separate or segregate, for want of a better term, the blocks or the titles from each other, then it would mean that those multiple titles would form part of a a single acquirable asset. And of course, you go down the path of looking at, whether or not something can be fixed or not fixed to land to determine those issues. The whole improvement issue that we can't improve an asset with borrowed monies. We can improve an asset with super fund money. We can't change the nature of that. And again, the flow on from that into the whole gnarly provision issue associated with, if you're making improvements to an asset of the fund, is the fund paying directly for that, or is a related party undertaking those transactions? And is that in accordance with 17B of the SIS Act? Is it in accordance with the requirements of what is a contribution and acquiring assets from related party transactions? So, when we're looking at limited recourse borrowing arrangements in totality, we have to look through so many other issues associated with superannuation funds, and particularly self-managed super funds and related party transactions. So, with the loan, is it to the SMSF trustee, or, as we're going to talk about, those intermediary trustees, is it to the holding trustee? But as long as it's documented correctly and appropriately, then we've got to make sure that that's all in place appropriately. Our rights of the lender against the party limited to the acquirable asset. Again, some of these are the points that haven't changed since day one. That the asset is held in custodial holding trust, and that we get that in-house asset exemption that applies. And of course, I'll be talking a little bit about what happens when an LRBA ends today, and the options that are available to us. And so that in-house asset exemption obviously applies before the borrowing is entered into, but also after the borrowing is entered into. And so, there's not necessarily a need to transfer the property from the holding trustee to the SMSF trustee, other than you've got other ongoing administrative costs associated with it if you've got a corporate holding trustee and things. So, it's a matter of weighing up whether it's the appropriate decision to make for the trustees of the fund. The trustee has the immediate 100% beneficial interest in the asset, and then the super fund has the right to acquire the asset once paid out. Again, as I said, most of that stuff has been in place since 2010. Some of it's been in place ultimately since 2007 when the original legislation came in. But primarily, we follow through these basics to make sure that we understand the requirements. We also then have to make sure that when we're looking at those key factors from before, that they don't lead into any strategic or compliance problems for the fund. One of the obvious ones, and I'm sure I've used this example before, is the demolition and rebuild, where one of the very first LRBAs I ever had any engagement with was someone that had done the right thing from the borrowing point of view. They'd purchased a property and then they went and demolished it to build a couple of townhouses and to subdivide the property. And so ultimately in that situation, they would have been in breach in the LRBA requirements or the borrowing requirements as such. And so, look, I don't ever know what the actual outcome of that one was, whether they ended up paying off the loan and then doing the subdivision themselves, or whether they ultimately used capital of the fund to rebuild what was the original property, or at least a house on it. Because again, like when we talk about improvements, there's nothing that suggests under an LRBA you can't use other capital such as insurance proceeds or capital within the fund, maybe funded via contributions, to rebuild what was there before. You just can't change the nature of it. So, rebuilding, subdivision, all those sorts of things are problematic. Renovations themselves, not necessarily problematic from the ability to undertake them, more problematic as to whether or not you're using borrowed monies to do it. Property fit outs, who's responsible for it? Is it the landlord? Is it the tenant? These sorts of things can be somewhat of an issue, because if you've got make good provisions and things like that within the lease arrangement. But again, most of these issues can be overcome with regards to how the fund operates. And I've seen sort of over the past couple of years a number of sort of different or new products hitting the marketplace that talk about home and land packages and the concept of an initial and a final payment, and using other parties to effectively accommodate all those ongoing payment requirements for you. I've never felt that was necessarily an issue, and I go back to a lot of the supporting material from the tax office via the NTLG in the early days, and they talked about it. It didn't have to specifically be one payment and then a final payment. That from a drawdown point of view, that you could have ongoing drawdowns as long as it's part of the original limited recourse borrowing arrangement. And so I've got a question there from Chris. Can you say replace a kitchen with the super fund money? Yeah, you absolutely can. I think the question that really arises, Chris, is whether or not you are replacing the kitchen or whether you're maintaining the kitchen. So, if you're actually doing a kitchen refurbishment, so you are enhancing what you previously had there, then that would be classified as an improvement. And so as long as you're not using borrowed money to undertake those improvements, then absolutely that's possible. I mean, that ruling SMSF 2012/1 that I mentioned before, that goes to certain extremes with regards to not just the kitchen fit out or replacing the roof or replacing the guttering, but it talks about adding bedrooms or adding swimming pools and all sorts of things that weren't part of an original property. It doesn't change the nature of it being a property, so it doesn't change the asset, but it's whether or not we're classifying something as a repair and improvement, or a repair and maintenance or an improvement, which then distinguishes whether or not you can use those borrowed monies. And I guess one of the key issues, and I've done a bit of reading, a few articles have been brought to my attention over the last 12 months with regards to repairs and maintenance, and the fact that you can use borrowed monies, but do you have to actually go through the process of actually financing the loan and then incorporating those repairs and maintenance inside the new loan agreement? And it's one of those areas that I would say to seek out advice for. But of course, you can of course pay for repairs and maintenance using existing fund money as well. So in most instances, I see parties going down that path rather than any other path. So let me jump into this idea of these intermediary LRBAs, because as I said, I touched on them in a previous presentation I did, but there's been some further information or clarity that's come through from the tax office and the SMSF Association with regards to these intermediary LRBAs that I think help clarify some of the key points associated with them. So, what is it? Well, an intermediary LRBA is effectively an arrangement where the lender actually lends money to the holding trust rather than to the SMSF trustee. So it basically has, and interestingly enough, the tax office released this in-house asset determination SPR 2020/1. So they've been in existence, or these intermediary LRBAs have been effectively an approved process since 2020, but that document itself was backdated to 2007 when the whole LRBA arrangement came into being. And it's because there's been parties in the marketplace that have offered these intermediary LRBAs and have been effectively having ongoing discussions with the ATO and had sought and gained approval to use them, but it wasn't sort of more broadly publicised that they were possible. So the ATO, sort of to take away some of that conjecture, is the way that I see it, is that they released this interpretive decision to make sure, or this arrangement determination, they released it to give certainty to those parties that were using these vehicles that the in-house asset exemption would continue to apply, because it was deemed to be an investment in a related trust, which is where LRBAs can be viewed sort of holistically as problematic, is if they look like an investment in a related trust, which would make them an in-house asset because of the nature of the transaction. But we've already got the ingrained exemption to your standard holding trust arrangement under section 71(8) of the SIS Act, and this determination basically broadened the exemption under the in-house asset requirements to incorporate these intermediary LRBAs. So primarily, the difference between an intermediary LRBA and a standard LRBA is that the lender lends to the holding trust versus the SMSF trustee. But that's really, in sort of practice, the only main difference between the two transactions. There are some other practical benefits. So one of the things about the intermediary LRBA is that that you can provide for guarantees. So that was one of the issues that was always sort of up in the air with regards to commercial lenders and SMSF trustees as such. So there is the ability to provide for guarantees. But one of the other key issues with the way that it looks and the way that it operates is that ultimately, even if you've got the capacity to provide for guarantees, even if you've got all these other potential issues such as the LVR not being as strict as perhaps it might have been when the banks were lending to self-managed super fund trustees directly, that the requirements of any loan agreement must meet the conditions of the standard SMSF LRBA, and it must be disclosed that the borrower is in fact a self-managed superannuation fund and that they're just using the holding trust. So there are a whole heap of requirements that are placed on anybody that enters into an intermediary LRBA. But one of the primary things is that they disclose that it is a self-managed superannuation fund that is doing the borrowing. And so for all intents and purposes, the loan and the way that it's operated is exactly the same. The self-managed super fund is making the repayments. The lender has only got rights over the LRBA asset itself from as far as the super fund is concerned, but they can go and seek guarantees from other parties. There's no issue with regards to how that operates. So it's just an alternate lending vehicle or alternate lending channel comparative, when we look at that chart there, comparative to a stock standard self-managed superannuation fund. So all the money is going in via the holding trust. And again, what it does do from a simplicity point of view is it means that the loan and the mortgage documentation, so the title, are in the same name. So you've got your loan to the holding trustee, you've got the asset in the name of the holding trustee. So you've got a little bit of a cleaner approach to how these assets actually look. But one of the questions that came about through the introduction of these, or the ATO's position on these intermediary LRBAs, because this of course came out following super reform, was the way that the total superannuation balance add back provisions were worded. There was a question mark as to whether or not by entering into an intermediary LRBA you could effectively avoid having the asset sort of added back into your value from an LRBA point of view. Now, to give clarity to what I'm talking about there is that if a self-managed super fund entered into an LRBA on or after the 1st of July 2018, then there's a capacity to add back the value of the outstanding borrowing to the members' balances from a total superannuation balance point of view. And that obviously only applies in certain circumstances, and those circumstances are when the members have satisfied a condition of release with a nil cashing restriction, or the LRBA is between the SMSF and an associate of the SMSF. Now, one of the key things there is that the definition of an associate is actually different to the CIS definition of a related party. But again, for the purposes of the presentation and for most transactions we see, when we talk about associate, we are identifying largely related party transactions. And so if we've entered into an LRBA after the 1st of July 2018, if we've satisfied a condition of release with a nil cashing restriction, or we've got an interest in so that condition of release with the nil cashing restriction applies regardless of whether it's a commercial or related lender, then we add back the value of the loan to the member's total super balance. But if we've got an LRBA with an associate, then in that instance, the amount is added back in regardless of whether you've met the condition of release. So that's our standard rules. The question came about, well, do those add back provisions count with regards to intermediary LRBAs, because the way that the tax provisions were worded and the tax provisions had words along the lines of the superannuation provider. So there's words within the tax provision that talk about it counting towards the superannuation provider, and so saying that the superannuation provider is a super fund, whereas the holding trust was a totally separate entity. But what we've got since these intermediary rules came out, and this came out in December 2022 from the SMSF Association via their technically speaking bulletin, that the ATO confirmed that intermediary LRBAs are not excluded from the add-back provisions. And so again, it just makes it totally clean across either way that you approach these LRBAs, whether directly through the SMSF borrowing or whether the holding trust is doing the borrowing itself. It will count towards the members' total superannuation balance if the members have satisfied a condition of release with a nil cash restriction, or they've got an interest that supported an asset subject to an LRBA between the SMSF and an associate of the fund. So, that's provided a little bit more clarity. And so what we then have to know, and I've got an example to work through with you in a moment, what we then have to be mindful of is what that all means. And so from a total super balance point of view, we've got the proportion that gets added back into the members' total super balance, which is calculated by determining the ratio of the total super interest supported by the borrowing that are attributable to each member. So, in very simple terms, if you've got two members in the fund and they've both got 50-50, then whatever the outstanding borrowing is, we're going to attribute that 50-50 to each member's total superannuation balance. So it's a clean way of doing it. What it also does, however, is it actually means that from a member point of view, from a contribution point of view, we're not just looking at the annual returns. We really have to look at the MyGov or wherever our total super balance is reported to us to determine whether or not there's been any of these add back values, because in the super return, right, as we've got there on that slide, the outstanding LRBA is reported in section F. So that then amount gets added back in, proportionately gets added back in to the members' accumulation interest or pension interest, subject to where they are in the scheme of their life cycle, and that will then enhance or increase their total superannuation balance. And of course, the impact of that is that it may make them ineligible for the carry forward concessional, may make them ineligible for making non-concessional contributions if they've got more than the $1.9 million when you add back that amount into super. So it does have ongoing impact to determine what somebody's total superannuation balance is, and it's going to be tested when the loan is entered into and on an ongoing basis until the borrowing has been repaid. So let's have a look at that from an example point of view. Let's have a little bit of a look at the total superannuation balance, just so we can have some sort of clarity as to what that means. So we've got Harry and Beth, and this is effectively an example taken out of the ATO document about how to calculate total superannuation balances. But you've got Harry and Beth. So Harry's 66 and Beth's 64, and they're both members and directors of the HB SMSF. 30 June 2022, Harry's balance is 600,000 and Beth's is 400,000, and they're both in accumulation. So we've got a 60-40 fund, and we're going to stick with a 60-40 calculation as we go through. They enter into an LRBA to acquire commercial premises for $1 million on the 1st of July 2022, and the fund borrows 700,000 from a commercial lender. So they've gone out, they found somebody that will lend the money. They're using the LVR, the 70% element there, and at 30 June 2023, from a calculation point of view, the value of the properties increased to $1.1 million. The fund holds $700,000 in cash, so the total fund is 1.8 million, and then the liability has been reduced to $650,000. So Harry's total superannuation balance is his accumulation value, which is $690,000. So once we take the 650 off the 1.8, it means that 60% represents $690,000. And then $390,000 is added to that, which is 60% of the $650,000 outstanding, meaning that Harry's total superannuation balance is $1.08 million. Now, $1.8 million or $1.08 million is neither here nor there from any contribution rules. He's well and truly out of the capacity to do carry forward contributions, but the fact that he had 690,000, he was already out of that. He's well short of any issues with regards to the bring forward provisions. So there's no issue there. And where it would have been potentially an issue is if Harry had have gone to commence a pension in the following financial year, then he may have become an annual, or it may have gone from being an annual reporter to a quarterly reporter for transfer balance cap purposes. But as we know, the transfer balance cap rules have been changed from the 1st of July 2023, and now all SMSFs are quarterly reporters, and so that doesn't have any impact at all. But what we do know is that Beth, her accumulation value being 40% of the balance of the fund is $460,000. However, because Beth hasn't satisfied a condition of release, we're not adding in 40% of the outstanding loan value. So with Beth's total super balance being $460,000, it would still make her eligible for the use of, say, the catch up or carry forward concessional contribution, the rolling 5-year period. So that is quite significant in this sort of example. However, that's because it's with a commercial lender. If it was an associate, if the lender was an associate of Harry and Beth, then Beth's total superannuation balance, it would be irrelevant that she hasn't satisfied a condition of release with nil cashing restriction. That would be irrelevant, and her proportion would be added back in. So again, the nuances between a commercial lender and a related lender, a condition of release and not satisfying a condition of release, can have an impact on a lot of other measures that impact the superannuation industry. And of course, the great uncertainty moving forward is our $3 million higher tax threshold. So, you know, if we're talking about that being based on total superannuation balance, and all indications to this point are that it will be, then what we know is that total superannuation balance for anyone that's entered into an LRBA from the 1st of July 2018 will include that loan amount if it's a related party loan, or if they've met a condition of release. And given that, you know, 65 is probably nearing that age when more people are going to be impacted by that $3 million balance. And so a number of people in and around that age, if they've got limited recourse borrowing arrangements, it could conceivably create a problem for them, which of course is part of the feedback loop that's come around about with that $3 million cap and the additional earnings tax. It's part of the consultation process with Treasury. It's saying, okay, well, you want to have, or you have indicated that you want a simplistic approach to how this is calculated for everybody. But if you've got one way of calculating total superannuation balance for one party and a different way of calculating total super balances for an alternate party, and that alternate party being those that have entered into LRBAs before 2018 versus those that have entered into LRBAs after 2018, then again, there's inequity within the way that legislation could potentially work. So these are all the issues that as an industry, the SMSF space needs to be mindful of, because we already know or feel that the approach to this $3 million cap or has problems associated with it. So that's the way that the total super balance rules work, and people need to be mindful of that, particularly those that have safe harbour loans in place. And speaking of which, let's move in and have a little bit of a look at these safe harbour rules and what the issues are associated with them. And primarily the biggest issue associated with them is that for the 2023-24 year, the interest rate for a property transaction point of view under the safe harbour rule has gone from 5.35% to 8.85%. So that is significant. And what that means is that SMSF trustees right now are scrambling or needing to be scrambling to ensure that they can meet their repayments, because again, under our safe harbour provisions, we've got a responsibility to be making monthly principal and interest payments. So for anyone that was operating in a variable interest rate environment under the safe harbour requirements, they've got payments that not only they need to increase, but they need to make sure that for the 12-month period that they are making those payments. Because if we extrapolate this out and take it to the worst case scenario, well, if we haven't increased our interest repayments for, say, July and August, because we just haven't got around to it, then is there an argument to say that the fund is paying a non-arm's length expense associated with that investment? And I suspect that the argument to that is probably yes. And if that's the case, then we could be tarnishing the transaction, the limited recourse borrowing arrangement, with non-arm's length income. So we really want to make sure that if we've got any of our clients with these safe harbour loans, that if they haven't made those catch-up repayments yet, that they've got the capacity within this year to ensure that the full year's principal and interest repayments have been made, to make sure, to guarantee that there are no gnarly issues once we get to the end of the financial year. And of course, that's the property transaction side of things. The other side is the listed securities, which is the variable housing loan rate for investors plus 2%. So instead of 8.85%, we have an interest rate of 10.85%. So again, that is pretty sort of serious numbers that we're looking at when we've been operating in a 5% environment or a 5.5% environment, and we need to be sure that we can satisfy the requirements. But there's a couple of other things that an increase in the interest rate sort of throw up around this time that we're looking at. Is so not only have we made changes to the repayments, the regular repayments, but where are we sitting with regards to our LVR? So are we still under that 70% requirement from an LVR point of view, or are we actually over it? Because if we're over it, do we need to make additional principal payments to bring ourselves back down under the various safe harbour requirements? So, for me, there's just so many areas that we need to factor into what we're looking at when we've got these related party loans, to ensure that we're meeting all of the necessary conditions. So again, for me, it's something that we want to make sure that our clients are on top of, and that they're documenting appropriately, so that they're documenting any changes that have been made to the monthly repayments. And of course, this is on top of, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, this is on top of any additional repayments that they are forced to make because they applied the relief under the COVID provisions, and so they reduced their repayments under that initial COVID term, and then are having to catch up on those payments. And remembering that when we're talking about the COVID relief, that the tax office were very clear that they're not expanding the safe harbour provisions, so you can't extend the term of the loan beyond the original 15 years. So whatever is remaining is the maximum amount of time that you have left. So if you'd had the loan in place for 5 years, COVID hit, you had 10 years left, well, you couldn't then go and refinance to another 15-year loan. You could only sort of look at the 10 years remaining. So you're already under financial strain to make those additional repayments, so that when we add in this additional increase of interest up by 3.5%, what further burden is that going to put on trustees? And I think that's something that is front of mind for a lot of parties. And when we look at that from an ongoing discussion point of view, then we need to say, well, is this the appropriate time to look at what commercial lenders are out there, and is there a capacity to amend or to refinance with one of those commercial lenders. And one of the things to be mindful of is from a refinancing point of view. Even if we're looking to refinance and we go, okay, well, I don't want to follow this safe harbour guideline set out by the ATO. The ATO have never said that from a related party loan that you have to follow the safe harbour rules. The requirement is that if you want to make sure that you're not viewed upon and the fund is not sort of targeted from an audit point of view, then they suggest you follow the safe harbour provisions. But if you want to do a related party loan and you want to use an interest rate or whatever that might be available from a commercial lender, and there are clearly commercial lenders out there at the moment that are lending at less than 8.85%, then you can't just refinance or recreate a related loan to meet those terms. You actually have to have supporting evidence to show that the banks or the lender was willing to lend you that amount at that rate, and then you can use that as supporting documentation if you then go and refinance your own loan. So it really is a major case of dotting your I's and crossing your T's when it comes to refinancing, to ensure that you're not putting yourself into some form of compliance grey spot by just changing the terms to suit yourselves or suit your clients' needs based on what might be available in the commercial environment. It's got to be based on what would have been available had that lender had signed you up because you'd gone and done your due diligence. And I want to take this a step further, because with a lot of these related party loans, there is also the considerations that the loan has to also meet the criteria of Division 7A of the Income Tax Act. So where there is a related entity, certain related entities that lend to the self-managed superannuation fund, then that loan would have to be measured up against the Div 7A requirements as well. Otherwise, it means that the amount, the requirements might be included as a deemed dividend and then potentially taxed as non-arm's length income. So we need to make sure that we satisfy the requirements. So if we look at this example here of John and Kerry, and they're members of directors of the JK Super Fund, and they entered into a related party LRBA to acquire a premises for $800,000. Fund borrowed 100% of the purchase price by their family trust, which is a related party lender. The initial terms of the written loan agreement also included an interest rate which followed the Div 7A benchmark requirements per income year, and a loan term of 25 years secured by a registered mortgage. So how did John and Kerry deal with the conflicting conditions within the ATO published guidelines? So let's have a look at some of those conditions as they currently stand, and then we'll sort of muse over what that means for John and Kerry. So for Div 7A, they've got to have a written agreement to make it a compliant loan. The Div 7A interest rate is measured against the indicator lending rates from the RBA, which is the bank variable housing loan interest rate for owner occupiers. So that difference, the difference between a Div 7A compliance and a PCG 2016-5 is one is against the owner occupier, and then the other is against the loan for investors. So therefore, the benchmark interest rate from a Div 7A complying loan for the period to 30 June 2024 is 8.27%, right? Whereas for PCG 2016-5, it is 8.85%. Right? Maximum loan term under a Div 7A loan is 25 years. Under PCG 2016-5, it's 15 years. So what that would mean, if we go back and look at John and Kerry, is that whilst they are satisfying the requirements of the Div 7A, right? So by applying previously maybe 4.77%, and then increasing that to 8.27%, they are not meeting the guidelines for PCG 2016-5. So whilst they're not going to have an income tax issue with regards to Div 7A, they are going to have a potentially a gnarly issue from the PCG 2016-5 because they haven't met the safe harbour rules. And so even if they're paying 8.27%, right? Which, and again, if I go back here, if we look at the marketplace, and I did my research before the presentation, you can in the marketplace find interest rates between like 6.5% and 8.5%. So there are variable rates out there in the marketplace. So by applying 8.27%, you know, your first thought of process is, well, okay, well, we're meeting the condition, or the loan is commercial, because that's more than what the banks are actually charging, or the lenders are actually charging at the moment. But the reality is, you haven't got anything that confirms that someone was going to give you that rate, some other lender was going to give you that rate. And so under the tax determination 2016-6, it's going to be problematic for the fund. Again, the other big one there is the 10 years, versus, sorry, the 10-year gap between a 25-year loan and a 15-year loan. So it is important that we meet both the Div 7A and the PCG 2016-5 requirements if we've got a loan from the related entity. And so in almost all instances, following the PCG is what's going to get that compliance, because it's going to meet the requirements of the Div 7A, and of course then it's going to meet the requirements from a compliance point of view for tax purposes. So just some pretty key issues to be mindful of if we're going down that path. But as I said, there are certainly interest rates available at the moment, and again, how long do lenders take to potentially catch up and increase their own interest rates? So we might see those numbers, that 6.74, which I think is at the moment, the one that I was looking at was targeting particularly refinancing. So it was a bit of a sweetener deal. But you know, how long until we see those jumping up towards the ATO rates as well? Only time will tell, but it is an opportunity that people need to go and look at reviewing their LRBAs now. So as I said, this was just a piece that I wanted to add, because it was, since I did the last presentation on this subject matter, we have had the Council of Financial Regulators did a report in September 2022, which was about leveraging money in the superannuation system. And they provided a number of stats. So the growth from 2013 to 2020, the growth in the size of the assets. So it went from 8 billion to 59 billion in that same percentage, and recognition that in most instances where LRBAs were applicable, there was less diversity within those funds, so that they made up at least 70% of the total assets when an LRBA existed. So there was issues around diversity. You know, whether that creates concern, because most of the time the LRBA sat in that sort of $200,000 to $500,000 dollar range, and you know, there was at least, or close to, half of the funds that had LRBAs that it represented 90% of the assets. Now we know that what was it? Might have been close to 2019 anyhow, that sort of time frame. The ATO issued letters to, I think, 17,000, 20,000, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, self-managed super funds where they had exposure to LRBAs, and at least 90% of the asset was that LRBA. So they really targeted that diversification. They didn't say it was a problem necessarily. They just sort of said, have you considered the diversification issue? And that's probably been, I guess, brought to light again from this review that was done, and that in some instances there are or is poor advice being provided. But the overall conclusion was that that the use of LRBAs has not posed a material risk to the superannuation or broader financial system since they were introduced. So that makes it interesting, particularly in light of, I guess, for most of us, the objective of superannuation considerations. And you know, we'd be crystal balling to suggest that that the capacity to borrow inside a superannuation fund will either stay or go under the objective of superannuation. But if we get clarity on what the objective is, and we know that the government have highlighted, I think it's 5 points or 5 key points that any policy needs to flow through on, to determine whether something should be in or out of the super system, then does or do LRBAs sort of meet those conditions? And I think would be an only time will tell sort of scenario with regards to that. So I still think it's a little bit of watch this space with regards to LRBAs. And for those of us that have been around long enough, they've pretty much been under the gun since they were introduced in 2007 with regards to government reviews. And so whilst we've seen actually minimal change, so the biggest change really has been the changes from 2007 to 2010. So those 2010 changes were significant. And then the next biggest change was really the tidying up of the interest element with the introduction of PCG 2016-5 and the safe harbour rules. So I think in many instances, those two events have helped to clean up the associated issues with LRBAs. And the final issue really is that diversification one, as far as the percentage of assets concentrated in LRBAs in certain self-managed superannuation funds. And again, how do you govern that? Do you put in place restrictions as to the size of the fund you need to have before you borrow? I think you're going down a slippery slope if you start to head down that path. But it's certainly something that people need to be mindful of. So, sort of as I start to move towards the end of the webinar, I guess there's a couple of other issues that I want to tidy up or finish off with. And one of those issues is the paying out of the borrowing. So the point where we get to the end of the loan and potentially transferring or looking to transfer the asset out of the fund, but also where that all sits with regards to the in-house asset determination that I referenced on this page 2014-1 about the whole transfer of the asset out of the fund. And it's interesting. I raise an example here because as we talk about this, and I mentioned earlier today that with regards to that determination, that SPR 2014-1 about the LRBA in-house asset exclusion, and that exclusion says that the related trust is not an in-house asset, once it's entered into a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. So of course, the way that the transaction operates and the way that the interpretation is, or that the determination is interpreted, is that in a normal set of circumstances, you will identify the property and you will put down a deposit on that property, and that deposit effectively creates, or that contract creates, the holding trust transaction. Now, in that very first instance, until the borrowing is entered into, until the property settles, there is no debt in place, but the asset is theoretically named under the holding trust. You then have the loan arrangement in place, so you've got the asset still in the name of the holding trust, and then you get to the end and there's no debt, and you pay out the investment, leaving the asset potentially within the holding trust environment. But we had a scenario come up recently where we had a client who went to enter into a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. So they acquired the property in the holding trust, and then for other reasons didn't need, or felt they didn't need, to actually borrow money anymore. And so the risk that we felt that this client had was that they had acquired this asset in a related entity, and it could potentially then burden that entity with being a 1322C or something, and those other restrictions, all because they hadn't entered into a loan. And so what we said was, well, okay, well, why don't you enter into a very small related loan in accordance with the PCG 2016-5 terms? Then you can distinguish or extinguish that loan, and by doing that, you meet the condition of the SPR 2014-1. We also said perhaps go off and get some legal advice on that, but we looked strategically as to what that would actually mean. So I've got a question here that I might just read out. Have you ever encountered a situation where the asset is sold at a loss, and we have a client with a related party LRBA for listed shares who would like to dispose of the shares, but the current market value is less than the value of the loan? what happens then? So the reality there is that this is the whole purpose of why these things were called limited recourse borrowing arrangements in the first place, is that the lender, in this instance, the related party lender, is taking on the risk that you are not going to get the full proceeds of the loan paid back, right? And so if the asset is subsequently sold at a loss, right, then, and the repayments have effectively stopped, then that is the risk that you're enter into as an LRBA in the first place, or as an LRBA lender. Hence why things like the interest rates and that were higher to start with, so to effectively compensate the fact that you might not actually get the full benefit. It's also why there is no restriction on obtaining personal guarantees for these sorts of transactions, but it's also not mandated that you engage in personal guarantees, which is why, again, the intermediary LRBA arrangement has become popular, because there was a greater capacity in those instances to seek those personal guarantees. So really the answer to the question is that, without those guarantees in place, the lender is effectively the one that loses out there if the asset is sold at a loss. So the super fund has paid out what it can, but there's no further recourse on the super fund or against the super fund in that instance. So again, to finish off, if the asset is being disposed of, then the sale process will be used to discharge the loan, and any remainder will be paid to the self-managed superannuation. And I'll come back to just to finalise that question in a moment for you there, Tiffany. So when the loan is fully repaid, the super fund has the right to obtain legal ownership of the asset from the holding trustee. It's not an obligation, so it's a right, but it's not an obligation. And of course, one of the reasons why people might not do it is because of the potential stamp duty that might be triggered. So by retaining the asset in that holding trust afterwards, there's no breach of the in-house asset requirements. Okay, so the LRBA restrictions continue to apply if the asset remains in the holding trust after the loan is repaid, i.e. the changing of the assets to a different asset. So you can't change the nature of it because you're still operating under the existing LRBA arrangements there. So again, and that's because the determination says that the asset is held in accordance with the requirements of 67A. So you've got other issues to consider. So it's not a free-for-all if you retain the asset in the holding trust. If you do transfer it across, so if there's no stamp duty obligation, then you can start to change the nature and start to do things like subdivide or whatever else might be the issues associated with that there. So just to wind up that other question that I received before, would the balance of the loan that isn't being repaid be considered debt forgiveness, which I think is a contribution in the super fund? Member is ineligible to make contributions. So no, this is the thing. So debt forgiveness is more where the super fund has the capacity to pay out the loan. And again, I might actually, in this instance, Tiffany, seek a bit more research afterwards. But my immediate answer would be that if the asset is sold, and so effectively there is no greater capacity to repay that loan as such, then I would say that the lender loses out. Now, forgiveness of the loan would generally mean that you actually are retaining the asset, and so therefore you're retaining the asset, and as a result just wiping out the debt. And then in that instance, because you retain the increased value of the asset, the difference there is what's treated as a contribution. So I think there's a little bit of a difference between those two sets of circumstances. But what I will do is I will just sort of seek a little bit more clarity, and perhaps with the email that when SuperGuardian send out the CPD, I will get something added in there. I'll make sure that we have an answer provided to that question. So again, once we transfer it to the holding trust, we need to make sure that all of the necessary documents and that support that, so that we've got the rates notices, the leases, and all that are updated to the name of the trustee, and also that the mortgage over the property is also removed. So again, nothing new here, all of our various ATO guidance documents. And I think, like, to me, the two ones, that TD 2016-16 and SMSF 2012-1 are two really good documents regards to how these things operate, and that people should be mindful of. And a lot of those other ones are relatively old references there. My takeaways: so the key concepts for LRBAs, that they play a fundamental role in the ongoing compliance of the SMSF borrowing arrangement that we need to be aware of. The intermediary LRBAs aren't common, but they do need to be understood, given that they are complying now based on the ATO's position there. Ensure that any related party borrowings comply with both Div 7A laws and the PCG requirements from a safe harbour point of view. That we don't see any systematic risk with leveraging at the moment. However, I'd be watching the space with regards to the objective of superannuation, and then understand what our obligations are when the loan is to be paid out. So understand that the options are available to retain it in the holding trust under the more restrictive requirements of an LRBA, or move it from the holding trust to the SMSF trustee and remove all of those associated restrictions with it, but that might come with some potential stamp duty issues. So look, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you got some value. I will certainly take on notice that that final question there with regards to the selling at a loss, and whether or not there's going to be an issue. And I'll make sure that answer is provided with the slides and the CPD that we send out. So thank you very much for attending. And if we haven't got any more questions to come through the Q&A, then I will stop the recording, and I will say thanks and hopefully see you next month. And we'll let you know very soon what the next subject matter will be for that webinar. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you later.